Cross secret. 7 hours of press, girl. 7 hours. That doesn't seem like it should be.
To do what we do and to make movies is such a privilege, and I love it more than I can ever fully explain because it allows me not only to tell stories but also to connect with all of you. I feel incredibly grateful that so many of you have been here with us through 3 summers of hard work and shared memories, and even if you were only able to join for 2, or if you're returning just for this one, you are still part of something very important to me. This experience hasn't just been about the work itself, it's been about the people, the relationships, the laughter, and even the struggles we've faced together. It has been both a hard and wonderful journey, filled with challenges that pushed us further than we thought we could go, and moments of triumph that reminded us why we fell in love with this art in the first place. To have walked this path with all of you by my side is something I'll never forget, and for that I am truly, deeply thankful. Of course, journeys are rarely without setbacks, and one of the most memorable ones for me came during a particularly difficult audition. I had what I often call my worst audition experience, and it left such an impression that I still remember every detail. It was for a Broadway revival of a very famous and beloved musical, and I had gone into the room prepared to give everything I had. But while I was singing, the producers and directors weren't paying attention at all. They were casually ordering lunch, distracted, as though my performance were background noise. In that moment, it was crushing to feel invisible, to wonder whether all the effort and passion I had poured into my preparation even mattered. Yet life has a strange way of balancing things, because only a week later, I booked West Side Story, a role that changed everything for me and reminded me that rejection doesn't define your worth, it just redirects your path. Fast forward to the present, and Disney's choice for their new Snow White has brought me once again into the spotlight, though this time under a very different lens. Recently, I became the target of South Park, which decided to take aim not only at me but at everything the new Snow White remake represents. This wasn't just a throwaway gag or a light-hearted joke, it was a thorough and unapologetically sharp critique wrapped in satire, dissecting the decisions, the cultural shifts, and the controversies surrounding the project. It raises an important question: why is this film sparking so much debate and conversation even before audiences have had the chance to see it on the big screen? The answer goes back to the very beginning, when my casting itself became a lightning rod for discussion. The idea of a Latina actress taking on the role of Snow White, a character originally described in the fairy tale as having skin as white as snow, became the starting point for months of debate, arguments, and endless think pieces across the internet. Some celebrated the casting as a step forward in diversity and inclusivity, while others saw it as a break from tradition, and that clash of opinions only grew louder as time went on. But casting wasn't the only decision that fueled the controversy. The narrative itself has been completely revised, moving away from the story people grew up with and venturing into new territory that challenges the familiar structure of the beloved classic. For some, this bold creative direction is exciting, offering a chance to reinterpret the tale for a modern audience. For others, it feels like a betrayal of the original spirit, as though the essence of Snow White is being rewritten in ways that leave little of the old magic behind. All of this, casting, narrative changes, and the broader cultural implications, has made the film a lightning rod for conversation, long before a single ticket has been sold. In this modern reimagining of Snow White, the most striking change is the complete removal of the romantic plot line. Gone is the fairytale prince who sweeps in to save the heroine with true love's kiss, and gone is the familiar thread of romance that once served as the heart of the original story. Instead, the new narrative reframes Snow White as an entirely independent figure, one who doesn't need rescuing and appears to be at the center of her own destiny. From early descriptions, it even seems as though she is positioned less as a damsel in distress and more as a revolutionary leader, spearheading something that feels more like a social movement than a fairytale adventure. For some audiences, this bold shift is refreshing, a chance to modernize a tale that has been told and retold countless times. For others, however, it feels like a departure so radical that it risks losing the very essence of what made Snow White resonate for generations. What was once a classic fairytale has been reshaped into something entirely different, and for longtime fans, the question arises, is this still Snow White at all, or simply a new story borrowing her name? The transformation doesn't stop there. One of the most iconic and beloved aspects of the original, Snow White's 7 companions, the dwarfs, has also undergone a complete overhaul. In an effort to avoid stereotypes and modern-day controversy, Disney abandoned the traditional concept altogether. Instead of the small, whimsical miners with distinct personalities who have lived in popular culture for nearly a century, the new film introduces an entirely different group, one that many feel barely resembles the characters audiences grew up with. For Disney, the change was likely meant as a way to sidestep preconceptions and adapt the story to today's cultural climate. Yet for many fans, this alteration strips away one of the core identities of the tale, replacing it with something unrecognizable. The film no longer feels like a faithful remake, but rather a project trying to establish its own voice while still borrowing the title, the brand recognition, and a few scattered symbols of the original. As all of this stirred conversation, Rachel Zegler herself became a lightning rod for further controversy. In interviews, she openly dismissed the 1937 animated classic, calling it outdated, strange, and even troubling by modern standards. While such comments may have been intended as honesty or critical reflection, they were received by many as dismissive and disrespectful toward a film that is not only cherished by fans but also holds a special place in cinematic history as Disney's first feature-length animated project. To complicate matters, Zegler's attempts at light-hearted humor sometimes came across in ways that intensified backlash. Her offhand remark about disliking apple-flavored snacks on set, meant as a playful nod to the poisoned apple at the heart of the story, was seized upon online as further evidence of her indifference, if not disdain, for the role she had been entrusted with. Very quickly, internet sentiment began to shift. What had started as debates over creative liberties with the story evolved into a sharper, more personal critique. Does the star of the film even like or respect the material she's representing? For some viewers, that question became harder to ignore than the changes to the plot itself. And then, as if the controversy needed an accelerant, South Park entered the conversation. Known for its ruthless and unflinching satire of Hollywood trends, the creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone seized upon the Snow White discourse as prime material for their special, Into the Pandaverse. The episode didn't explicitly name Rachel Zegler, but the references were unmistakable. At the center of their parody was the broader critique of how Hollywood has increasingly reshaped classic characters under the banner of modern inclusivity and corporate strategy. In the episode, Cartman is suddenly recast as a fearless female protagonist, Stan finds himself with a completely different ethnicity, and Kenny and Butters undergo transformations that are equally jarring. The humor lies not only in the absurdity of watching these well-known characters altered so drastically, but also in the uncomfortable truths the satire highlights. By exaggerating the trend to the point of absurdity, South Park forces audiences to laugh while simultaneously asking themselves whether Hollywood's constant reinventions are motivated by creativity or by calculated pandering. The brilliance of South Park has always been its ability to mock while making its audience reflect, and in the case of Snow White, the show turned an ongoing internet debate into a cultural commentary. For viewers who were already skeptical about the remake, the episode felt like a validation of their frustrations. For those who had been more open to the changes, it served as a reminder of just how deeply the film's choices had divided opinion. In either case, the satire ensured that the conversation surrounding the movie wouldn't die down anytime soon. What began as a fairy tale remake has now transformed into something much larger, a battleground over tradition, modern reinterpretation, corporate decision-making, and the role of actors in shaping narratives that are bigger than themselves. What made the South Park episode so striking, and why it resonated beyond just a quick laugh, is that the creators didn't limit themselves to mocking the characters, the actors, or the easy surface-level controversies surrounding the Snow White remake. Instead, they aimed their sharpest criticism directly at the studios themselves, and Disney in particular. The satire wasn't gentle, it was blunt, loud, and unapologetically clear. The episode might as well have been shouting, "Hollywood isn't really making progress here. They're recycling the same tired formulas, dressing them up with superficial changes, and selling them back to us as though they're bold new creations." And for many viewers, that message landed with unsettling accuracy. Because while most audiences genuinely want more inclusivity, diversity, and meaningful representation in the stories they consume, it feels disingenuous when a studio swaps a character's gender or ethnicity without also investing in fresh narratives, deeper writing, or a unique creative vision. It's the difference between innovation and illusion. Changing the packaging without changing the contents is not the same thing as moving forward. It's like pulling an old product off the shelf, slapping on a shiny new sticker, and insisting it's groundbreaking. Reports quickly began circulating that Disney was less than amused by the portrayal. Behind the scenes, rumor has it that executives were privately fuming and even complained to members of the South Park team. The very idea is comical. One of the largest, most powerful media conglomerates in the world, armed with billion-dollar franchises, global marketing machines, and armies of publicists, rattled by a pair of satirical writers and a group of animated fourth graders making fart jokes while exposing corporate hypocrisy. It's the kind of scenario so perfectly ironic that if you saw it in a scripted show, you'd dismiss it as too unrealistic. Yet that's exactly the genius of South Park, its ability to take real-world absurdities and amplify them just enough to make audiences realize how bizarre the truth already is. And Disney, of course, is not a stranger to South Park's irreverent lens. The House of Mouse has been a favorite target for years. From Star Wars to Frozen, the creators have gleefully skewered some of Disney's most sacred properties, often portraying Mickey Mouse himself as a ruthless, money-hungry overlord, equal parts mob boss and marketing executive. What made this latest satire different, however, is that it wasn't just about lampooning a single film or mocking a single character. This time, the subject was bigger than Snow White or Rachel Zegler. It was about the broader trajectory of modern Hollywood, the endless cycle of reboots, remakes, and reimaginings, the heavy-handed attempts at signaling inclusivity, and the press tours that sometimes feel more like moral lectures than celebrations of creativity. At the center of all this chaos sits Rachel Zegler herself, a rising star who suddenly finds herself pulled into a storm much larger than her own career. On the one hand, she is a talented actress who has earned accolades and recognition for her abilities. On the other hand, she has unwillingly become a symbol, a lightning rod for frustrations that audiences are directing not just at her, but at the entire industry. Every remark she makes in interviews, whether it's dismissing the 1937 Snow White as outdated or making a playful joke about apple-flavored snacks on set, becomes fodder for online debates, further inflaming the perception that the lead actress doesn't respect the story she's been chosen to embody. It's an uncomfortable position for any performer, caught between the role she's playing and the cultural war swirling around it. But South Park's critique extended far beyond her. In the Pandaverse special, the creators held up a mirror to Hollywood's recent trends with a ruthless clarity that made the satire sting. The plot was not subtle. It depicted an entertainment industry so obsessed with checking diversity boxes and chasing the appearance of progress that it has forgotten its most fundamental responsibility, telling good stories. The brilliance of the episode lay in its use of its own cast to make the point. Cartman, transformed into a brash, no-nonsense female protagonist, becomes a caricature of the kind of strong female lead Hollywood often markets with vague slogans and empty empowerment catchphrases. Stan is arbitrarily recast with a different ethnicity, not to serve the story, but simply to tick a box. Kenny and Butters undergo equally forced changes, their new personas more about corporate messaging than narrative purpose. The result is both hilarious and unsettling, making viewers laugh while also making them question just how closely this parody mirrors reality. That is South Park's enduring genius, its ability to ridicule while simultaneously forcing reflection. For fans tired of endless reboots and hollow attempts at representation, the episode felt like validation. For others, it was a wake-up call, highlighting just how entrenched these patterns have become in mainstream media. Either way, the satire hit a cultural nerve, crystallizing frustrations that had been bubbling under the surface for years. By the time the credits rolled, it was clear that the Snow White controversy was never really about a single film or a single actress. It was about the entire Hollywood model, an industry struggling to balance progress, profit, and storytelling, an often confusing one for the other Kenny and Butters. Two of South Park's most beloved characters became exaggerated parodies in the Pandaverse special, reinterpreted in such a way that they functioned less as characters and more as props to underline the satire. Their new identities weren't crafted to tell a better story or add depth to the narrative, they existed to prove a point, to highlight how shallow representation can feel when it's applied without care or creativity. The results were wild, absurd, and undeniably entertaining, but also deeply unsettling because of how close to reality it struck. Viewers were forced to ask uncomfortable questions. What exactly are we getting out of these changes when Hollywood rebrands characters in this way? Are these shifts genuine attempts at inclusion, or are they just thinly disguised marketing tactics designed to appease audiences on the surface while selling the same recycled content underneath? Reactions were split, as they always are when South Park takes aim at cultural flashpoints. Some applauded the episode for finally saying out loud what so many people had been whispering for years, that swapping a character's gender, ethnicity, or identity without creating a compelling new story isn't groundbreaking, it's lazy. It is, in essence, corporate indolence masquerading as progress. Others, however, saw the episode as unnecessarily harsh, branding it anti-woke or reactionary. But regardless of how viewers interpreted it, the episode reignited a central truth. Authentic representation cannot come from recycling old characters through a modern filter. True inclusivity in art comes from bold storytelling, building new worlds, introducing audiences to original heroes, and crafting narratives that stand on their own rather than leaning on the legacy of beloved classics.
You're wondering where I've been. Hi everyone. I'm not back, but I just wanted to say.
Caught in the middle of this storm, Rachel Zegler suddenly found herself under a level of scrutiny that she likely never anticipated. Almost overnight, every statement she had ever made about the project was pulled up, clipped, and circulated across social media, dissected in comment sections and used as ammunition by critics. There was the interview where she referred to the original 1937 animation as antiquated and creepy, a remark that, while perhaps intended as light commentary, came across to lifelong Disney fans as dismissive of a cornerstone of animation history. There was also the soundbite where she expressed that she expected to be compensated with streaming fees for every hour her film was watched online, a perfectly valid stance in the context of broader labor negotiations in Hollywood, but one that many thought sounded less like a call for fairness and more like entitlement when heard out of context. The issue wasn't always the substance of her words, but the tone in which they were delivered and the way they were received. Most people agree that actors deserve to be paid fairly for their work, and many recognize that old films do carry elements that feel outdated to modern sensibilities. But when those points are made without care, they can come across not as empowerment, but as arrogance. Disney fans, in particular, hold their classics with near-sacred reverence. They expect the actors entrusted with those roles to treat the material with respect, even if they bring a modern perspective. So when Rachel joked about never liking apples, the very symbol of Snow White's tale, or when she casually brushed aside the story as strange, it was enough to make some fans feel she didn't value the role she had been given. To them, it wasn't just another acting job, it was an opportunity to step into a character that millions of people had grown up loving. That's where the animosity truly began to simmer. What might have been a normal cycle of internet debate around a remake evolved into something far larger. For devoted Disney fans, Snow White is not simply another fairy tale, it represents the foundation of an empire, the beginning of Walt Disney's vision, and a legacy that shaped childhoods for generations. To see that story treated with anything less than reverence, whether by the studio itself or by the actress carrying the mantle, felt like an insult. The tension between modernization and tradition, between representation and nostalgia, between artistic freedom and fan expectation, all crystallized in this one project, and Rachel Zegler, fairly or unfairly, became the face of that cultural collision. What once began as an exciting revival of a beloved classic was now being reshaped into something that felt less like a fairy tale and more like a glitter-covered lecture. The trailer's release, which should have been a triumphant showcase to win over audiences, instead added fuel to the fire. Within moments, people noticed how starkly different the tone was compared to the original. The enchantment, that old Disney magic that once defined Snow White, seemed to have vanished completely. Gone was the prince, absent entirely from the narrative. The dwarfs, iconic and memorable in their individuality, had been entirely reimagined into something almost unrecognizable. And the storyline, once simple and timeless, was now reframed into a hazy tale involving a stolen crown, a threatened kingdom, and a heavy emphasis on individual empowerment. While these are admirable themes in themselves, the problem for many was clear: it didn't feel like Snow White. Instead, it felt like the name was being borrowed, its nostalgic power used to sell tickets for a story that had little connection to the original. This was where the split began in earnest. On one side, there was genuine excitement. Many viewers felt it was long overdue to see a fairy tale princess with a modern message, one not defined by a prince, romance, or waiting for rescue. For these supporters, the decision to cast a diverse lead and pivot the story toward independence and empowerment was something to celebrate. Yet on the other side, a wave of anger and resentment brewed. Fans who had grown up cherishing the 1937 classic felt deceived. They didn't want a reinvented narrative or a new social message grafted onto an old story. They wanted the same tale that had enchanted generations, updated visually but faithful in spirit. To them, Disney's choices felt less like innovation and more like betrayal, a deliberate break from tradition disguised as progress. Complicating matters further were Rachel Zegler's own public remarks. Whether fair or not, her interviews became viral talking points, each quote magnified and replayed endlessly. Her criticisms of the original film as antiquated or creepy, her playful jab about disliking apple-flavored snacks on set, and her insistence on fair streaming compensation, all valid in some contexts, were often interpreted as arrogance rather than authenticity. Instead of reassuring fans, these moments added gasoline to the flames, reinforcing the idea that neither the studio nor its lead actress truly respected the legacy of Snow White. Into this cultural firestorm stepped South Park, which transformed the entire debacle into comedic gold. The satire wasn't just aimed at Zegler or even Disney alone, it went after the entire machinery that keeps this cycle of reboots, rebrands, and recycled ideas churning. With merciless clarity, the show skewered a system in which optics and press releases are prioritized over genuine storytelling, where characters are altered not to deepen the plot but to generate headlines and social media buzz. In essence, the message was clear: look closely. This isn't about creativity. It's about publicity. They're selling you representation without substance. The brilliance of South Park is that audiences laughed while nodding along, recognizing an uncomfortable truth many had already suspected. Hollywood doesn't always lead culture anymore, it reacts to it. Artistry has been replaced by algorithms, decisions made less by imagination and more by data-driven predictions of what will trend. The irony, of course, is staggering. A crude, satirical cartoon became the most reasonable and logical voice in a conversation dominated by billion-dollar corporations and meticulously crafted PR strategies. When South Park ends up articulating what audiences feel better than the industry itself, it's a sign that something fundamental has gone wrong. And perhaps the most telling part of the entire saga was Disney's response, or lack thereof. Instead of addressing the controversy head-on or defending their creative vision with conviction, the studio responded with silence. No fiery declarations, no passionate statements, no attempt to clarify the narrative. Just quiet, a silence that echoed louder than any press release could. To many, that silence felt like confirmation that the criticism had struck too close to home, that even Disney knew its strategy was more about optics than originality. There were even persistent rumors that Disney had gone so far as to discreetly contact the creators of South Park, attempting to dissuade them from mocking the company's endless parade of reboots in future episodes. Whether or not those whispers are grounded in fact, the very possibility is telling. If it is true, it reveals that the satire hit harder than the studio ever anticipated. For a corporation as powerful, calculated, and tightly managed as Disney, every move is carefully strategized, every word crafted to protect its image. The notion that an animated comedy, one famous for crude humor and outrageous caricatures, could destabilize that carefully constructed reputation is staggering. It suggests that the parody didn't just land, it wounded. And in the entertainment industry, perception can be just as damaging as profit loss. When a company loses control of the narrative, especially one that thrives on shaping the public imagination, the consequences echo louder than any box office figure. Behind closed doors, reports claimed that executives were genuinely unnerved. They worried the jeering would go beyond a momentary internet meme and instead crystallize into a cultural turning point, one that could permanently tarnish the brand's glossy facade. And honestly, their concern was justified. 4 years now, Disney has been running its remake machine at full capacity, churning out one reimagined classic after another: Aladdin, Mulan, The Lion King, The Little Mermaid, and now Snow White. While each new film was pitched as a celebration of heritage, audiences began to see the seams. With every release, patience thinned a little more. What once felt like a loving tribute increasingly looked like a calculated business strategy, a formula designed to squeeze nostalgia for every last dollar. Audiences might forgive one or two attempts, but when the cycle repeats endlessly, even the most loyal fans begin to ask, why? This is why South Park's satire was so dangerous. It wasn't just another joke at Disney's expense, it was a spotlight aimed directly at the formula itself. Suddenly, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The reboots, the checklist approach to casting, the promotional interviews that sounded less like genuine passion and more like scripted talking points straight out of a public relations manual, all of it was laid bare. Once people began laughing at the formula instead of buying into it, the magic started to evaporate. Nostalgia turned into parody. Wonder turned into weariness. What once felt timeless began to feel tired. And at the center of it all was Rachel Zegler, who, whether by choice or accident, became the unwilling face of this larger debate. For a rising actress still in the early stages of her career, it was a monumental responsibility to carry, and not an easy one. Some of the backlash she faced was undeniably cruel, but other criticisms weren't without merit. Fans of the classics weren't simply upset about casting decisions or narrative shifts, they were protective. To them, Snow White wasn't just another fairy tale, it was the first of Disney's great legacies, a film that laid the foundation for the empire itself. That history carries weight. When you step into a role like Snow White, you're not just playing a character, you're becoming a steward of cultural memory. That's why every word you say matters. Instead of reassuring audiences that she cherished the original while bringing something new to the role, Zegler's remarks often came across, fairly or not, as dismissive, even condescending. Jokes about the original being outdated or about her dislike of apple-flavored snacks on set felt trivial, yet they echoed loudly in a climate where fans were already skeptical. For many, her tone signaled not empowerment but entitlement, as if the old story had to be diminished to make the new one shine. But fans still line up for those old films for a reason, and it isn't only nostalgia. It's the simplicity, the heart, the innocence of storytelling that doesn't need overcomplication. It's the melodies that stay with you for a lifetime, the hand-drawn artistry that feels alive, and the purity of emotion that made audiences fall in love in the first place. Those classics aren't just entertainment, they're a part of people's childhoods, and childhood is sacred. When fans feel that reverence being ignored, frustration is inevitable. And the magic, the kind that once defined Disney's legacy, is steadily lost when layers of politics, marketing strategy, and corporate-approved propaganda are stacked on top of the story until the heart is buried. What should feel like a tale of wonder begins to feel like homework, as though audiences are being graded on whether they learned the lesson embedded in every line. Escapism turns into obligation. That's precisely what South Park captured so effectively in their parody. Their brilliance wasn't limited to the easy surface-level gags or the crude jokes that get the biggest laughs, it was in holding up a mirror to the fatigue audiences now carry. People are exhausted, not by diversity or progress itself, but by the sense that every single story has been transformed into a lecture disguised as entertainment. Instead of being living, breathing individuals, characters are flattened into statements. Protagonists become slogans, villains become metaphors, and every theater visit feels like sitting through a corporate training video about how to be a model citizen. The irony here is sharp, because audiences do want inclusivity. They do want to see different voices and different faces stepping into the spotlight. They want fairy tales that reflect a modern world. What they don't want is the disingenuousness that comes with stories designed primarily to protect or enhance a company's public image. They want honesty. They want stories told because a writer or filmmaker loved them enough to bring them to life, not because a boardroom of executives decided it would score points on social media. Real representation means building new worlds and new characters who carry their own legacies. It means creating, not repainting. Imagine how much more powerful it would have been if Disney had introduced a brand new Latina princess with her own universe, her own history, and her own mythology. Instead of being asked to modernize Snow White under the shadow of constant comparison, Rachel Zegler could have been celebrated as the originator of an entirely new chapter in Disney history. Her legacy would be hers, not borrowed. But of course, that's the risk Disney has been unwilling to take. Remixing a hit is always safer than gambling on an unknown. Repackaging a classic with a glossy sheen of 2020's relevance is easier than daring to create something from scratch. And so the company keeps dipping into the same well of nostalgia, hoping that a new coat of paint will convince us the water is still fresh. Yet audiences aren't fooled anymore. As South Park so mercilessly pointed out, the well isn't replenishing, it's running dry. Each remake feels a little more hollow than the last, each modern twist a little more forced, until the enchantment once associated with Disney feels more like fatigue. Nostalgia has turned into parody, and wonder has been replaced with weary recognition. This is the turning point Disney risks ignoring. If they don't start thinking beyond algorithms, beyond risk-averse formulas, and beyond the safety net of familiar titles, they may lose the next generation entirely. Today's children are not enchanted by repackaged stories their parents and grandparents already loved. They are hungry for new heroes, new songs, and new worlds they can call their own. And if Disney doesn't provide that, others will. Audiences are savvy. They scroll past trailers, laugh at the memes, and seek authenticity elsewhere. The loyalty Disney once took for granted cannot survive on recycled magic. And the most ironic twist of all? It wasn't a critic in a newspaper or a rival studio that made this case clear. It was a foul-mouthed cartoon. South Park, a show that thrives on exaggeration and shock value, managed to articulate with uncanny clarity what millions of viewers already felt in their gut, that Disney's storytelling had stopped being about magic and started being about maintenance. When laughter at a parody resonates more truthfully than the studio's own films, it's not just satire, it's a wake-up call.